Welcome back to my channel. The borderland, where Geronimo and his small bands moved, was a landscape of ridges, springs, and political seams. From the 1870s through September 1886, the southern Arizona mesas and the foothills of the Sierra Madre provided concealment and routes that ordinary law enforcement could not easily close. The principal actors were the Chiricahua, known in English as Chiricahua Apache, Indian agents and the U.S. Army operating from posts such as Fort Bowie and Fort Apache, and provincial authorities and rural communities in northern Mexico. The central question is direct. What led to Geronimo's repeated escapes, and why did that pattern decide the outcome in 1886? This question matters because the escapes were not random acts of banditry, but the result of interacting systems. One system was environment seasonal water sources, hideable passes, and a knowledge of game and trails that favored small mobile parties. Another system was law and administration reservation policies. Broken promises late or withheld rations and shifting command arrangements produced recurring crises of legitimacy. A third system was geopolitics, an international line that was porous in practice but rigid in law, where Mexican provincial authority and U.S. military power met with imperfect cooperation. Across these systems, tactical choices mattered. Mobility and local intelligence let a small group vanish over a ridge into territory where distant commands could not project force quickly. Social ties and cross-border kinship networks provided food shelter and guides. At the same time, federal limits, rotating units, constrained budgets, and political hesitation in Washington meant large, sustained operations were costly and intermittent. The consequence was a repeated cycle. An incident at an agency post or a raid in Sonora triggered pursuit. The band slipped south into mountain fastnesses. Supply lines stretched thin. Pursuit paused or faltered. Then the band resurfaced when conditions allowed. By fixing date, place, and actors, we set the stakes. The endpoint most histories mark is the September 1886 surrender at Skeleton Canyon. The story that follows explains how terrain administration and human choice combined to produce a pattern of escape until policy logistics and exhaustion converged to end active resistance. The roots of repeated flight begin with dispossession and policy failures that compressed Chiricahua lifeways and turned mobility into liability. After the Mexico-United States War, settlers, miners, and railroad builders moved into formerly remote hunting ranges, and watercourses and treaties and removals increasingly confined Apache groups to reservations where seasonal rounds could no longer sustain subsistence. San Carlos in the 1870s became a focal point intended to gather disparate groups, but it was poorly sited and poorly provisioned, leading to chronic shortages and unrest. Administrative failure delayed rations, corrupt distributions, and heavy-handed enforcement at agency posts turned subsistence tensions into open resistance. Economic and environmental change amplified those pressures. Grazing and mining reduced game rail and stage routes, increased traffic and the value of stolen stock and seasonal rhythms. Dry seasons that concentrated people at springs and monsoon months that changed passability shaped when and where movement could succeed. Mobility was not merely cultural preference, but a livelihood strategy that clashed with a reservation system designed for sedentary oversight. Administrative arrangements produced exploitable seams. Responsibility for Indian affairs split between military commands and civilian agents. Commanders rotated, agents changed, and Washington's appetite for costly, long campaigns fluctuated under congressional scrutiny. On the Mexican side, provincial authority varied from one locality to another. Sonora and Chihuahua maintained militias and mounted units, but lacked the consistent capacity to seal the high Sierra Madre. Cross-border law complicated pursuit sovereignty, constrained sustained unilateral action, even when informal cooperation existed at a local level. Those institutional mismatches turned mountain passes and arroyo networks into practical loopholes for small mobile parties. Kinship and local economies deepened the advantage of flight. Families with relations on both sides of the line could find shelter and provisions in ranches and villages. Rancheros, traders, and muleteers sometimes bartered or sheltered men who brought horses or intelligence. Informality in commerce and kin obligations blurred the line between refuge and complicity. The frontier was a social landscape as much as a physical one. Guides, interpreters, and double agents mattered. The Army's reliance on native scouts to track camps improved tactical knowledge, but also introduced risks of fracturing trust inside communities, because scouts' information could expose kin. That ambivalence meant decisions to stay and negotiate or to flee and forage were taken in small face-to-face moments, often invisible to official returns. Immediate triggers converted structural pressure into movement. Arrests of hunters, seizures of weapons, punitive policing, and acts of humiliation at agency posts frequently provoked flight. Notable breakouts followed episodes of violence in Sonora or Arizona that threatened family safety. When warriors judged their women and children at risk, they prioritized retreat into mountains over continued negotiation. The tactical pattern was consistent, a precipitating incident at an agency or ranch. A rapid withdrawal along seldom-used trails, a crossing into the Sierra Madre or adjacent wash networks, and then opportunistic raids to replenish horses' food and ammunition. Enforcement responses typically consisted of hastily assembled columns, telegraph coordination, and heavy dependence on local scouts, measures that could locate parties but rarely sustain a continuous blockade of every pass. Logistics and political limits often decided whether pursuit closed or faltered. Army columns required forage ammunition and steady supplies to maintain operations in broken terrain. Mexican provincial forces faced parallel constraints. When supplies waned or political pressure in Washington or in local capitals demanded restraint, patrols thinned and operations paused. Those pauses created the very breathing space mobile bands needed to move food and families to safety and to strike opportunistically. In that rhythm of crisis pursuit, withdrawal, and renewed mobility, Geronimo's choices were rational responses to a structural squeeze movement with survival. Flight was a strategy shaped by environment, commerce, and the uneven reach of state power. Understanding repeated escape therefore requires attending not only to bold leaders and daring marches, but to the web of treaties, policies, markets, and seasonal cycles that made the borderland a space where containment often proved impractical. Geronimo's pattern of escape unfolded as a sequence of pressured incidents rather than a single continuous campaign. Each episode shaped by seasoned terrain and local triggers that pushed small bands to vanishing points beyond easy reach. The first incidents that mattered were local and immediate: an arrest at an agency, a raid on a ranch, a stock theft, or a reprisal in Sonora. These events had a social geometry. When a hunter was seized or a camp burned, families faced a sudden choice: remain under tenuous protection and submit to a justice system they distrusted, or move with speed into washes and canyons where the state's reach thinned. What followed was a rapid withdrawal along lesser-known trails, a crossing of a ridge, and then a pattern of opportunistic raids to replenish horses and food while scouts probed for safe havens. The 1885-1886 episodes that scholars group under the Geronimo Campaign show this rhythm repeated across seasons and borders. Violence and memory fused in motive. Personal loss and communal revenge were often invoked by participants as reasons to leave or to strike. Geronimo's own recollection of massacres and slaughter was a recurrent explanation for raids that contemporaries labeled criminal. His words expressed grief that became a motive for mobility. Geronimo, Autobiography, Lawton, Oklahoma, 1905. In all the battle, I thought of my murdered mother, my wife, and my babies of my father's grave, and my vow of vengeance, and I fought with fury. That sentence circulated among military and civilian readers as both confession and context. It helps explain why episodes of flight were sometimes retaliatory as well as evasive. Season and terrain shaped the timing of major breakouts. Dry months forced concentration at springs and wells, making camps visible and vulnerable. Monsoon and winter weather shifted passability and opened arroyo corridors that invited movement. In May 1885, pockets of Chiricahua slipped out of San Carlos and into Sonora, taking advantage of seasonal conditions to reach game and water. Those breakouts often produced small skirmishes as cavalry detachments and local militia attempted to intercept them. Because the Apache parties moved light and fast pursuit columns, weighed down by wagons and supply needs, frequently failed to hold every pass. Military dispatches from the period report a string of searches and short engagements, rather than a single decisive battle. And contemporary press accounts emphasized pursuit and frustration more than battlefield carnage. Local politics and cross-border social ties converted tactical retreat into political complexity. Rancheros, traders, and villagers on both sides of the border sometimes sheltered fugitives or traded for stolen animals, while provincial authorities in Sonora and Chihuahua varied in how energetically they pursued fleeing bands. In several documented incidents, local Mexican officials were slow to act or lacked forces to mount continuous patrols in the high Sierra Madre, creating corridors of sanctuary. At the same time, informal exchange networks supplied food and intelligence to those on the run. Muleteers and remote households could transform a hunted party into a provisioned one overnight. These social connections made manhunts not only a military problem, but a diplomatic and economic one. Escalations followed predictable sequences. A punitive arrest or a violent reprisal often produced immediate raids into Mexican settlements. Subsequent Mexican responses sometimes provoked further reprisals or prompted Mexican governors to request U.S. assistance. In March 1886, General George Crook negotiated a conditional surrender with several Apache leaders, a move that briefly collapsed one thread of the conflict. Yet, within weeks, mistrust and miscommunication produced another slipaway into the mountains, demonstrating how fragile negotiated pauses could be when supervision or guarantees failed. Those episodes show why short-term agreements rarely stopped reappearance. The structural causes of scarcity and humiliation remained. And so did incentives to flee when the next crisis arose. Tactical adaptation on both sides intensified incidents. The Army increasingly relied on Indian scouts to track camps and on telegraph lines to coordinate columns. Scouts supplied critical leads but could not themselves close every gap. Conversely, the Apache used knowledge of hidden springs and alternate drainages to mislead trackers and to approach stockyards at night, striking supply lines that supported pursuing forces. One pattern repeated in field returns is the evening raid to take horses or mules, followed by a day's forced march into terrain of the pursuer's choosing. Those small raids replenished supplies and denied the enemy a single decisive encounter. Command decisions and political timetables shaped the scale of responses to incidents. When Washington or local capitals balked at sustained expense, or when congressional scrutiny demanded restraint columns thinned and operations paused. When political will and supply-aligned commanders could assemble larger forces, but often too late to prevent a slip south. Brigades sent in haste could force a temporary dispersal, but the logistical burden of keeping men fed, horses shod, and telegraph lines open in rugged terrain made continuous blockade costly. Officers' correspondence from 1885 and 1886 reveals repeated cycles of surge and withdrawal that mirrored the on-the-ground reality of chase and respite. Incidents also produced humanitarian consequences that in turn influenced subsequent movement. Women and children who accompanied bands endured exposure, food shortages, and disease. When a camp suffered a sickness or loss, the band's mobility dropped and vulnerability rose. Episodes that captured non-combatants produced immediate political backlash and sometimes hardened military orders. Other times, they produced negotiations that aimed at safe passage or exchange. In this way, rising incidents were not only military escalations, but social crises that shifted choices about whether to fight, flee, or bargain. By late summer 1886, the cumulative effect of successive incidents was evident. Repeated small breakouts had taught both pursuer and pursued to adapt, but it also exhausted local resources and frayed informal networks. The manhunt that followed the May 1885 and spring 1886 episodes escalated into a broader campaign, in which concentrated intelligence, better supply lines, and some sustained pressure converged. The rising incidents thus both explain how Geronimo could repeatedly escape and why those escapes eventually narrowed into the circumstances that produced the final surrender at Skeleton Canyon. The campaign of 1886 moved from episodic manhunts to sustained columns and coordinated drives, but it remained a contest of mobility versus logistics. In the spring of 1885, cavalry detachments and mounted militia set out from posts such as Fort Bowie and Fort Apache, while irregular provincial units in Sonora assembled where they could. Early operations were local sweeps intended to recover stock and deter raids. They were not yet campaigns designed to seal the high passes of the Sierra Madre. That changed as breakouts multiplied, and political pressure in Washington and state capitals forced larger responses. By late 1885, commanders were tasked not merely with chasing small parties, but with denying the borderland its usual breathing room. Orders moved down the chain in blunt phrases meant to signal firmness, even if they could not fully control terrain. Field dispatches demanded arrests and the return of captives. One often repeated formula was to insist on unconditional surrender to end raids quickly. Gatewood, Field Report, Skeleton Canyon, 1886. Unconditional surrender appears in later field recollections as the tone of terms officers delivered when they confronted leaders in the field. That clarity of language masked complexity on the ground. An order to seize or detain required men, horses, forage, and a supply line that penetrated canyons and arroyo corridors the Army could not permanently occupy without sustained effort. Tactically, the campaign combined regular columns with the indispensable work of native scouts. Officers organized search parties that moved from known watering points and arroyo mouths and deployed scouts who understood game trails and seasonal hiding places. The scout system improved intelligence and produced critical leads. It also introduced social complications because scouts' local ties sometimes complicated loyalties, and because reliance on small numbers could not substitute for continuous presence. The Army therefore alternated between rapid mounted thrusts, designed to surprise a camp, and slower lines intended to interdict retreat routes. Those slower operations demanded wagons and supply trains that reduced speed while increasing endurance. The faster thrusts risked running dry on forage. Marches and maneuver read differently at human scale than on a map. A column might leave Fort Bowie, cross a desert plain, pick a pass into a canyon, and then fan out along washes to find signs of recent travel. Pursuers spent days following crushed vegetation, scattered bits of campfire charcoal, and trampled grass. Pursuit across ridgelines required horses in good condition and guides to point out faint game trails that led to springs. Conversely, those fleeing moved light and often at night. They traveled in small groups with women and children among them and used knowledge of which arroyo would remain passable after monsoon storms. Those choices produced a pattern of forced march by pursuers in daylight, a cautious night advance, and then a morning that revealed only a cold fire ring and a set of tracks heading into higher country. Contemporary returns therefore read as sequences of search and discovery more than as a single contact battle. Command decisions shaped where and when supply lines were risked. General George Crook emphasized negotiation combined with measured shows of force moving columns into mountain flanks while attempting to secure surrender through intermediaries and promises of better treatment. Crook's approach used Apache scouts and local guides to penetrate into Sonora and to assemble surrender parleys, and it produced temporary successes, including surrenders in early 1886. When Geronimo and others broke those terms and fled again, commanders faced criticism in Washington and pressure to escalate. That pressure led to the replacement of Crook with General Nelson Miles, whose approach emphasized denying support in Arizona by relocating potential allies, then moving large numbers of troops into the field to press the band and its support networks. The Miles strategy attempted to combine attrition with cordon operations that targeted the route south into the Sierra Madre. A field officer's after-action recollection captures how attrition and coordination changed effects at the tactical level. Lawton, After Action, Report, Arizona Territory, 1886, wrote of the need to secure waterholes and to maintain telegraph contact so columns could synchronize movements. That emphasis reflected an operational truth when telegraph and wagon trains kept units in contact. Commanders could mass force at likely exit points and reduce the number of open passes a fleeing band might use. Even so, complete blockage was rarely feasible because of the length of the line and the limits of available men. Telegraphed orders shortened reaction time, but could not create permanent garrisons at every ridge and arroyo. Fact versus folklore disputes arise in assessments of how decisive force was. Popular narratives sometimes emphasize a dramatic final battle or a singular act of betrayal that ended mobility. Documentary returns and correspondence suggest a different causal mix in which logistics intelligence and sustained pressure narrowed options over time, but in more than one decisive firefight. Local oral histories may emphasize heroism or treachery in ways that reflect memory and identity rather than the arithmetic of supply. Noting those differences does not invalidate oral accounts. It situates them alongside documentary returns and thus allows a more complete explanation of campaign outcomes. The campaign's human costs were unevenly recorded. Army returns list engagements, prisoners, and captured stock. Civilian accounts catalog raided ranches and murdered settlers. The campaign imposed a heavier toll on women and children who accompanied bands as forces sought to move them to safety. Sickness, exposure, and scarcity were routine. Those humanitarian stresses fed back into tactical choice. A band that lost stock or suffered illness had fewer horses for rapid withdrawal and therefore narrowed its viable escape routes. Conversely, a successful night raid that recovered horses or provisions restored strategic options and delayed closure. The ebb and flow of raids and counter-raids thus becomes intelligible only when read as mutual adaptation between a mobile society and a state with logistical limits. By mid to late 1886, a shift in operational posture brought persistence that earlier surges had lacked. Miles's relocation of potential supporting populations, removal of Crook-era scouts to distant posts, and the concentration of supplies behind columns reduced the informal aid available to fleeing parties. The coordinated effort to interdict southbound passes and to present surrender as a practical alternative began to close the margins in which mobility once succeeded. Where early campaigns had followed patterns of pursuit pause and resurgence, the late 1886 campaign tightened the net through coordinated timing, better logistics, and a political will to sustain operations long enough to exhaust supply and will. That change in operational context did not erase the ingenuity and resilience Geronimo's followers showed in prior seasons, but it did in sequence and by degrees convert a rhythm of escape into narrowing strategic options that ended in formal surrender. The decisive turn in the long sequence of breakouts came not from a single battle, but from a convergence of logistics, intelligence, and political will that closed enough escape routes at once to make continued flight untenable. In spring and summer 1886, commanders and staff had observed the recurring pattern: short raids followed by southward retreats into the Sierra Madre, and then a lull while pursuers reassembled. That pattern exposed a strategic vulnerability for the Army. Intermittent surges could not seal the 1,000 miles of informal corridor that linked Arizona mesas to Sonora valleys, yet it also pointed to the remedy. If the United States could sustain presence and deny the few critical waterholes and passes for a season, mobility would lose its decisive edge. Two institutional shifts produced the conditions for such sustained pressure. First, commanders deliberately concentrated forces and supplies behind coordinated columns, rather than relying solely on ad hoc sweeps. Telegraph lines and wagon trains that once served only sporadic operations were used to synchronize movements and to position forage and ammunition where columns would need them during extended interdiction. Second, political tolerance for expense rose for a brief window. Congressional scrutiny of frontier disorder and political pressure from territorial constituencies made Washington and departmental headquarters willing to underwrite longer operations. Where previous campaigns had paused because of cost or shifting priorities, late in 1886 saw resources marshaled long enough to deny respite. Those shifts mattered because the borderland's practical seams were narrow. To close them required persistence, not simply force. Fieldcraft and human intelligence tightened the snare. The Army retained and redeployed native scouts who knew arroyo networks and spring locations. Officers coordinated those leads through telegraph to mass detachments at likely exit points. That coordination reduced the number of viable passes a fleeing band could use without encountering mounted columns. At the same time, commanders sought to disrupt the informal support network that had long aided fugitives. Removal of sympathetic local militia staging points, relocation of potential suppliers, and surveillance of ranch trails constrained the informal economy that had converted a hunted party into a provisioned one. Those measures were not foolproof, but they multiplied friction for those attempting to move families and herds across the line. Exhaustion and scarcity produced the immediate operational effect. Bands that had previously slipped south to replenish horses or to access kin reached a point where horses were thin and children weakened by exposure. One after-action admission captures the systemic failure that had made earlier breaks possible and that in turn required remedy. George Crook, Report, Washington, D.C., 1886. If you investigate the Indian troubles, you will find broken faith and supply failures at the bottom of many of them. That confession framed the turning point. The Army no longer faced merely a tactical adversary, but a political and logistical problem that could be reduced by denying supplies and by presenting surrender as a pragmatic alternative to starvation and continual flight. Personal interactions then produced the collapse of mobility as a strategy. Lieutenant Charles B. Gatewood and other intermediaries used known ties and parleys to exploit the narrowing options. Gatewood's missions combined firm terms with an understanding of Apache honor and survival imperatives. He could credibly promise better treatment under formal surrender and to facilitate movement that preserved lives. Those conversations mattered because they reframed the immediate calculus from advantage in mobility to a grim arithmetic of endurance. Continue fleeing and risk loss of children and horses, or accept escort and preservation of the band. The decision was not only military, it was a family choice under extreme duress. Fact versus folklore disputes attend accounts of final contact. Narrative traditions sometimes emphasize treachery or a single betrayal. Documentary returns and coordinated telegraph logs show instead a sequence in which supply denial and synchronized columns made Southern refuge increasingly tenuous. Oral histories that highlight heroism and evasion record the courage of those who resisted and the social costs of capture. Documentary records register the arithmetic of attrition. Both perspectives illuminate different truths. One locates meaning inside community memory, the other in logistical causation. Respectful synthesis places battlefield reports and oral testimony side by side and reads surrender as the product of both. The human cost at the turning point was immediate and concentrated. Records from late summer 1886 show diminished horse strength, higher sickness rates among children, and rising rates of food scarcity in camps on the move. Those conditions narrowed tactical options because rapid night movement depended on fresh mounts and the ability to cross difficult passes without prolonged daytime exposure. A night raid that in an earlier season might restore horses could no longer guarantee delay if the Army held the nearest springs, and the telegraphed columns could be timed to interdict withdrawal at dawn. Practical constraint therefore translated into moral urgency. Leaders confronted the prospect of attrition among non-combatants and weighed the reputational and survival costs of continued evasion. The final operational collapse occurred when coordinated interdiction and diplomatic pressure intersected with these material shortages. Miles's broader posture sought not only to capture, but to sever the informal networks and to reposition potential supporters. That posture rendered some traditional refuges unusable or far less reliable. Negotiated parleys by intermediaries provided face-saving options for leaders who had to explain to families why surrender was preferable to an uncertain and brutal march. Once a critical mass of leaders chose parole, The social logic of flight unraveled without the confidence that kin and ranch households would shelter a moving band. The incentives to risk a run south dissipated. Synthesis with earlier causes is direct. The persistent structural pressures outlined earlier dispossession, constrained seasonal rounds, and fractured administration had long produced the conditions for breakouts. The turning point did not erase those causes, but it exploited their opposite. Where scarcity and broken supply once enabled flight, now sustained supply denial, and improved coordination removed the practical means of evasion. In that sense, surrender in September 1886 is both an outcome of military adaptation and a restatement of the structural story when the state marshaled persistent logistical effort and constrained the informal economy that had protected mobile bands. Mobility ceased to be a sufficient strategy for survival. The choice Geronimo and his followers faced was not merely to yield to force, but to weigh survival against endless movement across a landscape increasingly closed by synchronized state action. The aftermath of the 1886 surrender reordered lives, land, and law. The Indi Chiricahua, who had moved between mesas and the Sierra Madre, were removed from the borderland and placed under long-term military supervision. Men, women, and children who once relied on seasonal rounds and kin networks found themselves processed through army columns and placed on distant posts where mobility was constrained by fences, patrols, and schedules. Transport manifests and War Department rolls recorded the movement north and later to posts as far as Florida and Fort Sill. Fort Sill prisoner registers and departmental correspondence preserved the administrative trace of removal and custody. Those records show movement not only of bodies but of legal status from autonomous bands to detained groups subject to military regulation. Federal policy responded with institutional measures meant to prevent further breakouts. The War Department and the Office of Indian Affairs implemented transfer orders and revised annuity and ration schedules that remade subsistence routines. Bureau of Indian Affairs ledgers and annuity vouchers document changes in payments, while Indian agent reports record efforts to impose schooling allotment and seasonal work programs intended to produce sedentary dependency. At the same time, congressional executive documents and hearings debated the costs and propriety of military custody and removal. These administrative instruments had immediate effects. Families were housed in fixed camps, children were enrolled in boarding schools, and customary patterns of travel for ceremonies and hunting were interrupted by residence requirements and military passes. Land and resource arrangements shifted as a direct consequence. Range leases and new railroad spurs that had earlier pushed Apache subsistence into scarcity now became legal five fixtures that reservation policy reinforced. Reservation boundaries were tightened and grazing rights curtailed so that former seasonal corridors became de facto closed zones. Agency reports and local county records show changes in land use that favored ranching and mining interests and restricted access to springs and arroyo networks essential to survival. Legal instruments, such as allotment proposals and later statutes, accelerated dispossession by trying to transform communal landholdings into individual parcels subject to sale. The result was a long-term reduction in mobility and a narrowing of economic options for the ND communities. Demography, health, and family life bore visible scars. Census returns and mortality registers from the decades after removal indicate population fluctuation and in some places decline due to disease and displacement. Epidemics of influenza and other contagious illnesses hit populations already weakened by poor housing and inadequate rations. Hospital and agent reports record higher rates of sickness among children and elders soon after transport to distant posts. Nutrition data and annuity voucher records suggest intermittent shortages, and the social dislocation of forced sedentarization contributed to both acute and chronic health problems. Those human costs reshaped family structures and ceremonial life because long-distance removal severed seasonal networks that had buffered food insecurity and caregiving. Cultural continuance adapted and persevered even under duress. Winter Count's ledger art and oral testimonies preserved memory and reframed events for future generations. Artistic objects and community ledgers that survive in museums and tribal collections function both as historical records and as acts of resistance. They demonstrate how the ND kept a narrative thread that emphasized survival kin obligations and moral claims against broken promises. Geronimo's dictated account and later public appearances became complicated signposts in memory documentary evidence that circulated in national print, while community stories recorded different emphases about motive responsibility and collective loss. That divergence between documentary and oral record is not contradiction, but complement. One archives movements and orders, the other preserves moral and social meanings. Law and litigation followed policy. Transfers and trials were processed through military tribunals and then civilian administrative reviews. Congressional hearings and executive documents debated the legal status of removed groups and the propriety of long-term detention. Claims records and petitions submitted by relatives and agents over subsequent decades document efforts to secure compensation, restoration, or improved annuities. Those records reveal a slow, piecemeal adjudication rather than a single remedial act, and they show how legal remedies often lagged behind the social damage of removal. Memory and public history shifted over the 20th century. Ethnographic collections and museum exhibits that once framed Geronimo as an exotic outlaw were gradually supplemented by scholarship that placed flight and surrender in structural context, dispossession, policy failure, and cross-border dynamics. Community commemorations, winter count exhibitions, and contemporary cultural revitalization projects reassert autonym and identity, and reclaim ceremony and language. Today, descendants live across reservations and urban communities. Many ND families maintain ties to Arizona, New Mexico, and Mexico, even as legal and administrative fences remain. Contemporary tribal programs for language health and land reclamation echo long-standing efforts to restore the conditions of mobility and cultural practice. In short, the aftermath was not a tidy closure, but an ongoing continuance. Removal and custody ended a specific era of armed movement, but inaugurated long-term regimes of control, economic marginalization, and cultural negotiation. The documentary record transport manifests. Fort Sill registers BIA ledgers. Senate executive documents and census returns combine with oral histories, winter counts, and tribal archives to show a complex picture the ND survived through adaptation and memory. Even as land law and policy remade the landscape of possibility. The persistence of cultural practice and the recent efforts at recognition and restitution remind us that aftermath is not a final chapter, but a continuing negotiation between communities and states. The surrender of Geronimo and the removal of the Chiricahua closed a specific episodic conflict, but opened a longer sequence of legal, economic, and cultural consequences whose outlines historians now treat as the event's durable legacy. Scholars generally converge on three principal conclusions. First, repeated escape was a product of environment policy and social networks. Mountain refuge water and trail knowledge combined with porous cross-border kinship and informal economies to make short-term containment difficult. Second, the final cessation of mobility in 1886 stemmed less from a single decisive battle than from sustained logistical adaptation, political will, and coordinated intelligence that narrowed viable escape routes until supply denial and attrition outweighed the advantages of flight. Third, memory and meaning diverged. Documentary returns and military correspondence emphasize operational arithmetic, while oral histories and community records foreground motive grievance and moral claims about broken promises. Both registers remain necessary to understand why the episode persists in public imagination. Contested points remain important for interpretation and for public history. Numbers and scale. How many troops were truly involved in each manhunt, and how many non-combatants were displaced? Vary between press accounts, military returns, and tribal testimony, producing different emphasis in narrative. The degree and character of Mexican cooperation is debated. Some provincial officials assisted actively, while others lacked capacity or will, and archival gaps in Sonoran and Chihuahua records complicate firm judgments about cross-border policy. The reliability of Geronimo's dictated memoir likewise invites scrutiny. His account is indispensable for voice and motive, but must be read alongside contemporaneous dispatches and agents' records to separate lived experience from later rhetorical shaping. Enduring legacy operates on multiple registers. Politically, the episode became a precedent for mass removal detention and the militarized administration of indigenous groups, accelerating patterns of allotment schooling and constrained mobility that shaped 20th century reservation life. Economically, the consolidation of ranching, mining, and railroad interests in the borderland hardened access regimes and transformed seasonal commons into enclosed property. Culturally, the Chiricahua preserved memory through winter counts, ledger art, oral narrative, and ceremonial practice. Those forms carried a critique of dispossession into public history and into contemporary revitalization projects. Museum collections, public exhibits, and scholarly syntheses have slowly shifted from romantic outlaw tropes to contexts that emphasize dispossession law and cross-border dynamics. Assessment, therefore, requires a dual lens: the tactical story of adaptation and attrition that explains the military outcome, and the structural story of policy, commerce, and environment that explains motive and consequence. Where documentary returns account for routes, commands, and supply the archival and oral record preserves grievance, ritual, and continuity. The event endures because it stages a fundamental friction in modern statecraft: the attempt to fix human mobility with law and logistics in a landscape designed by seasons, kinship, and survival. And because that friction continues to shape borderland politics and memory today. In the end, the border did not move. People did. Logistics met landscape, and mobility finally ran out of road. If you lived in that borderland in 1886, what single factor would have mattered most to you, water, horses, or trust? And which do you think actually decided the surrender